Hello everyone, just wanted to make a quick response to a video from Peach Bailey I found interesting, wherein she discusses natural aptitude and the education system. Now she discusses feeling like her time was ultimately wasted by the system, which is a rather common complaint these days, because ultimately what we're dealing with here is a system that's designed for jobs that no longer exist, attempting to prepare students for jobs that don't exist yet. Now she mentions both the high school / secondary system as well as the university system. Personally, I feel these to be two separate beasts, therefore I'll address them separately. Starting with high school, you have a much thicker layer of bureaucracy, particularly in public schools, where generally any sort of reform tends to get stuck in a legal and regulatory quagmire. About 10 years ago in Massachusetts, for example, there was a push for a concept called innovation schools. What these schools would do is basically put the teachers collectively in charge of the school and allow them to make reforms as needed. It was essentially to turn public schools into this amalgamation of public financing with charter school flexibility. Ultimately, the initiative failed, primarily due to the fact that principals really had no interest in giving up their power. This is part of the reason why the curriculum tends to be a bit more static than, say, at a university. Peach mentions that she knew what she wanted to do from the age of middle school. Problem is that majority of students, while they may have a sense of what they would like to do and would probably benefit from being able to specialize to a degree, most of them will still benefit from having a certain structure to their education process. And it really delves to the point of what really is the purpose of a school, frankly. Is it purely for education? Is it to prepare students for the job market? Or is it to develop more well-rounded citizens? Really, these are ultimately values questions which have to be answered on an individual level as well as the institutional level. Well, the current push is generally to get the schools more jobs-oriented. There are still vestiges of the older mode of thinking of having schools essentially be there to create more well-rounded citizenry. That's why you may have a student who's, say, more interested in engineering, who is still forced to take foreign language classes, history classes, English classes, and all the like. Currently, high schools in particular are designed with curricula that have to meet minimum standards. The idea isn't necessarily to point you into your chosen career path, but to more around you as a person. Though to be fair, the results can be fairly mixed. You could make the argument of, why does a engineer need to know poetry, for example? And conversely, why would an English teacher, for example, really need to know all that much in the way of maths? But at the end of the day, there's really no way to be 100% sure what career path the student will go down. There's been plenty of students who are dead set on a career and ended up achieving it fully, but there's also been plenty of cases where students were dead set on a career, then once they get into it find out that wasn't really for them. The point of high school isn't really to give you a specialization. That's more of the goal of a university degree. High school is basically just there to bring you up to the minimum standards and then give you the choice to decide your path from there. Now, I certainly agree that it's not exactly ideal the way it's being done right now. I could have easily finished high school much sooner than I did if I had simply been given the opportunity to finish it early. 4 years of high school was frankly a waste of time for me. By the time I got to my sophomore year and had become second in place in my high school, I just coasted for the rest of it and just remained there and was completely bored for the next 2 years. I do think that it would be more beneficial if individuals were able to move on from high school quicker and to really move past the classes that aren't particularly helpful for them if they're able to show basic aptitude within those courses. I actually remember during grammar school, probably would have to be somewhere around the second, maybe even third grade, there was this very interesting program that came into our school called Junior Achievement. Junior Achievement wasn't a regular class like the rest of it. For about 1 hour per week, a representative of the local bank actually came in and would teach a little course about how to function in society, essentially. How to fill out a check, how to open a bank account, how to handle your finances. Things like that. Obviously at a bit of a lower level, they have different programs for different grades, but the idea was teaching kids about finances, teaching kids about the political system, teaching kids about personal responsibility. Overall, wonderful little program, and it's actually still running today. It's a national program run by a non-profit. Essentially the combination of home economics and a civics class, just without any cooking involved. And I feel like high schools would really benefit if that sort of program was embedded within all of them. Because, as I've heard several times from high school teachers, they're repeatedly told that the point of high school is to not only prepare the kids for their future education, but to also prepare them to function in society on their own, as well as to give them the tools that they'll need to adapt to the newer jobs that are coming in. Since when high schools really were coming into vogue back in the day, society was still heavily industrialized, and really the only skills that you needed were reading, writing, and arithmetic, the good old 3 R's. Nowadays, though, it's such a varied degree of fields out there that it seems like administrators are at a bit of a loss as to what exactly to teach them at this point. Of the administrators that I do know, generally the idea among them is to try to strengthen students at their weak points. I personally disagree with this approach, since frankly, this tends to result in the neglect of the student's strengths, really. In my own case, for example, mathematics, history, and science were always my strong suits early on. Now, as time went on, I ended up getting better at the other subjects, but that was ultimately the result of my own interest in bettering myself at them, rather than the system itself. I remember being in the first grade, and at that time we would always do reading out loud for English, which I absolutely hated. English at that point was one of my worst subjects, really, as languages in general are a bit like bashing my head into a wall, frankly. It doesn't matter if it's spoken language, or music, or computer programming. If it's a language, or has the form of a language, just doesn't really work well with me. And I remember one day when we were reading out loud, it had gotten to my turn again, and my first grade self stumbling as I attempted to read any words that were past 3 letters, and feeling this intense sense of embarrassment as my peers were able to read easily 5-letter words without issue. And that day I went home, I picked up any book I could find and would just sit down and try reading. And any time that I found a word I couldn't read, I would simply go to my mother or my aunt and ask them for it. And within a few weeks of doing this for hours each day, I was able to actually use my aunt's encyclopedia. And anytime I would come across a word that I didn't understand, I'd sit there, find it in the encyclopedia, and figure it out. And after voraciously reading anything I could, by the time I had made it to the 5th grade, I was reading at a high school level to the point that I ended up maxing out the lexicon test they gave me. And it really touches upon the concept of natural aptitude. You may have heard of the 10,000 hour rule, which is a popular belief that you need to study for 10,000 hours to become a master in anything. This is based upon a misinterpretation of research that the researchers themselves have come out against publicly. As far as mastery of a particular subject goes, one study in Intelligence Journal attributed practice to only about, quote, 1/3 of the reliable variance in performance in chess and music. The largest meta-analysis in the field found that practice may be responsible for as little as 12% of mastery. Now, I'd like to emphasize here that this is in regards to mastery of a skill, as in becoming, say, a world-class chess master. This doesn't necessarily translate to meaning that just because you are not necessarily born with an innate aptitude for a particular skill set, that you will be unable to become proficient in it. This also doesn't mean that simply because you have an aptitude for a subject, that you won't have to practice in any way in it. The way I'd ultimately look at it is more of a floor and a ceiling than necessarily telling you where exactly one will end up in their chosen field. To round us off with a bit of a discussion on the university system here, I'd have to point out that you'll end up with significantly different experiences, even within the same university, depending upon your field. My primary major was in engineering, which ultimately meant that I didn't spend much time with the humanities outside of the initial 2-year humanities requirement. Actually, to touch on that for a second, That was probably one of the biggest points of contention I had with the scheduling, as scheduling of schools, particularly high schools, but colleges as well, can be extremely non-conducive to learning, both in the times of classes and in terms of the classes you'll take themselves. Overall, the degree I took really didn't have much in the way of fat to trim, but that was only after the initial 2 years. Prior to that, the humanities requirement in particular was frankly a bit of a waste, really. I feel it's rather patronizing to still be attempting to well-round students after they've already left high school, especially when it's costing them 2 years worth of university tuition and fees, which actually hits into the bureaucracy again, since an engineering degree needs to be ABET certified, and in order to get ABET certification, there is a required curricula that you must take, which includes the humanities requirement. After the initial 2-year speed bump, however, after that, the courses are all fairly relevant to the degree itself. And one of the nice things about STEM courses are the lack of politicization of the courses themselves that you tend to end up with in the humanities. One interesting thing that Peach does bring up, however, is the general lack of females in the STEM field. At my college, I believe the ratio of men to women was about 60-40 to 70-30 depending upon the year, so it's averaged out to about 65 male, 35 female. However, this was by no means evenly distributed. Within STEM, generally the biomedical engineering classes were mostly women. The physics classes and computer science classes had almost no women in them. Mechanical engineering was primarily male as well. Civil engineering was actually more evenly split than you would expect. It was probably about 60-40 male to female. And I'm of course referring to the majors themselves rather than the introductory courses that everyone may end up taking. So this results in something rather interesting, that even though you manage to get females into STEM, they will still end up tending towards fields that may be seen as stereotypically female dominated, as most biomedical engineers go into medical fields. Though outside of STEM, the business school is actually loaded with women in it as well. I'd say the split was almost nearly 55-45. But to quickly wrap this all up, overall I'd say the school system itself at large certainly can do with a reform. We simply have to decide what will be the driving ideology behind that reform. Preparing students for jobs, creating more well-rounded citizens. It's a fairly complicated issue, but clearly the current system is failing. For instance, in my high school class, I believe over half of the class did not end up graduating actually. I believe it was about a 45% graduation rate, and by any objective standard, that's an abysmal failure, frankly. And on that high note, I'd like to thank Peach for the very interesting video. I found it to be quite thought-provoking. I hope you all have a wonderful day.